In August of 1998, 4-year-old Kevin went out to play with some friends and never returned home. After his body was found, the case went from a believed drowning to a possible pedophile murdering children in the area. But the investigation would soon take a big turn when 2 children became the main suspects in Kevin's murder. Could 2 brothers, one 5 and one 7-year-old, be responsible for such a horrible act? This is the child murder case that in Sweden became known as the Kevin case. So hello everyone and welcome to my channel. My name is Elin and on this channel I cover true crime cases that have occurred in the Nordic countries. I want to give a huge warning before I start this video. This case includes children and sexual crimes against children, and it's also a case that made me very angry, so just a big warning before you start this video. I know that child murders is something that nobody wants to hear about, but I do think that it's important to spread awareness about this case because it takes a big turn. Or actually, it takes many big turns, to be completely honest. I'm also a bit tired today and low on energy, so hopefully that won't be too annoying throughout the video. With all that being said, now let's get into the shocking case that happened in Sweden. So Kevin Hjalmarsson was a 4-year-old described as happy, adventurous, and confident. He was also described as determined, loving, and caring, and he liked playing both alone and with his friends. Kevin also spent much time riding his red bike that was very precious to him. He lived with his half-sister and mother, and it was a small and trustworthy community, so it was common for the local children to play outside without any adult. Kevin was, however, not allowed to play down at the lake since he could not swim, so that could possibly be dangerous. Even if he lived with his mother, his father had also moved closer to him recently to be able to spend more time with him. On the 16th of August 1998, it was the last day of the summer break and many children were outside playing for the last time before school was gonna start. One of these children was 4-year-old Kevin, who left his house at around 4 p.m. that Sunday afternoon to play outside with some other children in the neighborhood. He was last seen by his friends around 5, and witnesses have described hearing unpleasant screams coming from the water at around 6 p.m. Kevin's family started looking for him at around 9 p.m. since he never returned home, and his grandmother decided to bike down to the lake where she also found Kevin's bike. Below the school football pitch, a wooden pallet was floating in the water of the lake Glafsfjorden. On top of that wooden pallet, 4-year-old Kevin's body was found by his grandparents in the evening, only a couple of 100 meters away from his home. They tried their everything, but he was already gone, and Kevin's mother came walking towards them and just screamed, "No, not my Kevin," when she realized what was going on. He was taken to the hospital and they tried to revive him, but he unfortunately did not survive and he was pronounced dead. It was first believed that he had drowned since he could not swim, but once the medical examination was done, it was clear that it was a murder. There was neck injuries, bleeding in the genital area that suggested a sexual crime, and bleeding in the eyes that indicated suffocation. The cause of death was suffocation due to strangulation towards the neck. Kevin's shoes and socks were also missing, which would not be likely in a case of drowning, and he also had sand in his underwear. At first it was believed that maybe some pedophile in the area could have committed this horrible act, but for some reason this theory was put aside pretty fast even though there were signs of sexual assault. One pedophile lived only 100 meters away from Kevin, and he was also seen helping Kevin on the day of the crime. He did, however, have an alibi for that evening, so he was ruled out pretty fast. Pretty soon after the murder, a timeline of Kevin's movements that day was established. At around 4 p.m. that Sunday afternoon, he met up with a friend called Robert, and they rode their bikes to Kevin's best friend Robin and asked if he wanted to join them. Robin's family had guests, so he was not able to, but they decided that they would meet up the next day instead. At some point, Robert and Kevin ran into a 13-year-old that they knew, and they looked up to him since he had a super cool bike. At some point, Robert left to go home, and Kevin was left alone with this 13-year-old, and I'm not sure who it was because he's never been named in the media from what I could find. They were then left playing in the schoolyard with some other children, and no one really heard or saw anything suspicious. Almost straight away in the case, children were suspected for the murder, and pretty fast, two brothers, one 5 and one 7-year-old, were named prime suspects in the murder case. This was after the 5-year-old's parents had overheard him saying that he saw some older kids speaking to Kevin on the day of the crime, so he was taken to the police station as his mother believed that he was a witness. In the car on the way to the police station, he had also stated that he saw the murder take place, but pretty soon suspicions were turned towards him and his 2-year older brother instead. This was actually the first time in history that a child was suspected to have killed another child in Sweden, and it was believed that they had suffocated Kevin by pushing a stick towards his throat. After 30 interrogations, the boys allegedly confessed, and this was a very important part for the investigation. According to the leading investigators' public statements, they described helping each other kill Kevin, and it had all started when the boys argued about who would decide in a game. Things had then heated up and escalated into an argument, and Kevin ended up on his back. The boys had then kicked Kevin even in his crotch and used violence with sticks before strangling him. After Kevin had died, they dragged him around 30 meters to the water and placed him on the wooden pallet. And not only does this sound very unlikely for a 5 and a 7-year-old, but I do also want to add that there was absolutely no drag marks on Kevin's body or on the ground around him. There was no witnesses to the act, but the boys, however, did have an alibi for the evening. Their family actually had guests, and one of them had been checking the boys regularly and saw that they were at home and not at the lake. So at this point in time, there was not really much information about the interrogations or how they were conducted, apart from the fact that the children were super restless and had a hard time sitting still. They did not have a lawyer or even their parents present in most of the interrogations, but there was, however, a child psychiatrist that was present. According to the people in the interrogation room, the confession was not the same as a normal confession from an adult, and they would not even describe it as a confession. But there had been small bits and pieces in their story that they could not have known if they had not been at the crime scene or involved. And I find this really interesting since they came to the conclusion that there was an argument that escalated, and I'm not really sure how they could conclude that. Some forensic evidence had been gathered, and the believed murder weapon had been found. This was a stick laying close to the crime scene, and there were fingerprints on it, but none of them matched the suspects. So it's pretty interesting that the believed murder weapon was a stick that could not be connected to the suspects or anyone else really, and this was pretty much the only forensic evidence that they had. Apart from that, some boys had found Kevin's shoes and socks at the place where his bike was found, and they handed them to the police. The bike and shoes had both been close to a shed, so it was believed that Kevin had been murdered close to this shed. As I said, the suspects were two brothers, and they were actually best friends with Kevin as they used to play a lot, especially with their bikes. One of the boys, called Robin, was the friend that Kevin had asked to play with that day. He was 5 years old, and his older brother, Christian, was 7 years old. Their parents had separated before Robin was born, but the boys mostly stayed with their father and his new wife. Since they were children, they could not be charged with murder, even if the case was believed to be solved, and the investigation was never really released to the public. But the investigation was actually praised by the people in Sweden because it was well done and it had only lasted for 3 months before the case was solved. One day, many years later, a journalist got a tip through an email that something might be wrong with the murder case, as this anonymous man had been researching interrogations and knew that long interrogations could involve many risks. When children feel pressured, they can actually start making things up and tell things that they believe the police wants to hear. The accused brothers, Robin and Christian, were at this point 23 and 25, and of course living on a secret address with hidden identities. They had never stated or talked publicly about what happened that day, but they had lived most of their lives believing that they were child murderers. The journalist could not let go of this information and tried to contact them, but he had a hard time reaching them for a long time. So he ended up calling their dad, and on this phone call, he just asked their dad that is it completely sure that the boys did it? So for 5 months, the family were discussing if they should meet this journalist or not, and they ended up meeting him. And together they decided to make a documentary that would turn the whole investigation upside down. In the documentary, one of the boys, Christian, recalled not remembering much from his childhood, but mostly remembered the time after the murder. He stated that the more he looked into it, the more he felt as if there was something wrong about the investigation and the murder. The other boy, Robin, recalled having a feeling that it was not him who murdered Kevin, but of course also wondered if it was him or if he was present. He stated that he remembers a lot of things from when he was 5, but nothing about this particular event. None of the brothers remember the murder, but do remember some parts of the interrogations. They described them as terrifying and remember the investigators telling them what they had found and what they believed had happened. The whole family believed that the murder was a mystery, but they had kind of just accepted the fact that the brothers had been sentenced, even though they didn't have any memories from the attack. In this documentary, they went through the preliminary investigation files that had never been made public, so none of the family had ever gone through it. Basically, all that was made public about the investigation came from the leading investigator or people working with the case. This leading investigator was also the person who initially believed that the children were involved. The preliminary investigation was over 1,000 pages long, and the interrogations had been filmed, which gave a pretty clear picture of the brothers. And I have seen some pieces from the interrogation tapes, but I think I cannot include them in the video as they are probably copyrighted. But from what I could see, it was clear that these interrogations were not conducted in a way that interrogations with children should be, and they were just completely unethical. In the tapes, Robin did state that he saw something that night. For example, he stated they did not listen, referring to the killers, and also said that he did not know who killed Kevin. He also stated that he saw them put a knife in Kevin's belly that was sharp. He later changed his story and said that a boy called Robert kicked Kevin into the water, but that he did not see much. Christian stated that he knew about this since the day that Kevin died because Robin had told him about it. When hearing these things, their stepmother got so upset that she had to be put in a mental facility, and during her stay there, the police came and interrogated her. Of course, during this time, she was confused and not doing well, so she ended up telling them that maybe the boys could have told her about Kevin on the day that everything happened, so a week before they took Robin to the police. The police took this as a fact and now believe that Robin and Christian could have seen the murder, and they were from this point forward seen as key witnesses in the case. There had also been a group of 13-year-olds by the water at the time that Kevin most likely died, and for a while the prime suspect in the case was one of these teenagers. Especially two of these teenagers stood out to the police as they constantly changed their stories, but they did not have any evidence against them and they didn't confess to anything. So they were now left with pretty much no suspects in the case, and since Robin was a 5-year-old and constantly changing his story, which is pretty normal for a 5-year-old, especially when he's getting pressured, the investigators started getting suspicious towards the brothers and believed that they were trying to cover up the murder. At some point during this time, the boy's mother reported that she had been discussing the murder with Robin when he suddenly said that his brother did it. A psychology professor also went through the interrogation tapes and he stated that the boys either knew exactly what happened or had been involved in the murder, but they had most likely repressed the memory from the crime. When their father got the news that his boys were suspected of a murder, he also ended up in a psychiatric facility, and once again the police came there and interrogated him during this time. So one time when the police interrogated him, he stated that he remembered a time when Christian had painted a picture of Kevin laying dead in the water. So this made the police even more sure about their theory, and they used this as evidence against the boys. In the last interrogation tape, the interrogator did not only use leading questions and literally tell Robin where Kevin had been hurt, she also pressured him by asking over 100 times what he did to Kevin and told him that he did something. This interrogation lasted over 2 hours, and honestly I felt physically bad when I saw how these boys were treated and kinda tricked into saying things that fit their storyline. After Christian had been interrogated for over 2.5 hours, he started crying and saying that he couldn't talk anymore, and they still did not stop the interrogation. So after 3 hours and 45 minutes, he pretty much started telling the investigators exactly what they wanted to hear since he wanted to get out of there. After 5 hours, they ended the interrogation, and in the tape, he never stated once that he killed Kevin. Conveniently, the only interrogation that was not recorded was the last ones that the leading detective had with Robin, and in this, Robin suddenly, according to the notes, confessed that Christian choked Kevin with a stick and that they then dragged the body to the water. The case was soon closed, and the conclusion was that Robin and Christian had murdered Kevin. So all in all, there was never a taped confession from the boys, and for over 18 years this was not questioned, not even by the family. And their lives, of course, were affected by this. They were told not to let anyone know about the murder, and they got threats and basically lost their old lives. In 2017, an article was published in a news site where they criticized the investigation and showed just how wrong the interrogations had gone. They also commented on the fact that the family never had a lawyer during this whole process and that the confession was never recorded. Around the same time, the documentary where I got most of the information for today's video came out. This documentary is called Fallet Kevin, which translates to The Kevin Case, and it later won a journalist prize for questioning the police's investigation in the case. After this scandal, the investigation was reopened, and in 2018, the brothers were freed from all suspicion in Kevin's murder. This case angers me so much because not only did two innocent people have their lives destroyed, but also because the true killer was never caught. I feel like if the police would have put this much effort into other leads instead of just pushing the boys into a confession, then maybe we would actually have answers to what happened that day. The police had been pressured and really wanted to solve the case, which I think is the biggest reason for what ended up happening. This is actually an example of a psychological term called confirmation bias, which is the tendency of people to favor information that confirms or strengthens their beliefs or values. It's clear in the interrogation tapes that everything that the children said that fit the police's theory was believed to be true, while everything else was seen as false. So they probably just really wanted to solve the case and ended up framing two innocent children just to have their solution, which is messed up. Some people still believe that the 13-year-old who I mentioned before could have been the killer since he knew Kevin, he was seen playing with Kevin that day, and he also gave a false alibi for that day. 9 months after Kevin's death, he was also arrested for the rape of a 3-year-old in the same area, and he admitted to this. He had also later stated to a girl in his class that he had done worse things than that, which I feel like is pretty telling. There was, however, never enough evidence against him, and he has never been charged with anything, so he's innocent until proven otherwise. But that's all that I have for this case today, and hopefully you enjoyed this video, even if it was a messy one. It was truly a case that shocked me while I was doing the research, so hopefully it was interesting to listen to. Thank you so much for watching today, and hopefully I will see you in my next case. Goodbye, everyone.